Legal pleadings. When you hear those words, do you picture thrilling courtroom dramas?
Probably not. Most people think, well, it sounds about as exciting as watching paint dry.
Right, but trust me on this one. This deep dive, it's going to surprise you. We're going way back in time, talking medieval duels, legal loopholes that'll make your head spin.
And we'll cover a Supreme Court case all about phone companies, believe it or not, that ended up changing how everyone argues in court.
It's amazing how much of what we consider standard legal procedure today, it all goes back. Centuries even.
It's true. The echoes of those, well, let's call them creative legal tactics, they're still with us. And we're going to, really unpack that, how those dusty old procedures still shape how we seek justice today.
So, if you're ready for a wild ride through legal history, let's get started. First up, we're hopping in a time machine back to England. Apparently, that's where this whole pleading thing got its start.
It all started there, yeah. And it wasn't pretty. Forget lawyers and briefs. Imagine a system where your fate, your whole legal fate, could be decided by something called trial by ordeal.
Trial by ordeal. Okay, you're going to have to explain that one. Sounds a little intense.
Oh, it was. Think holding a hot iron or getting dumped in water. Survive that, you're innocent.
You're kidding. I think I'd rather take my chances in a courtroom. So how did we go from that, literally putting someone through a physical test to, actual reasoned legal arguments? How did that transition even happen?
It was a process, that's for sure. A very, very slow process. One of the steps along the way, believe it or not, was trial by combat. Basically, you and your opponent duking it out.
Wait, like an actual duel, swords and everything?
Swords, maces, whatever the weapon of choice was at the time, I guess. Eventually, thankfully, that gave way to a more, civilized system with courts and judges. But even then, it was still really, really formal. Early pleadings, they were like a high-stakes game of chess with every single word, every tiny detail potentially making or breaking your case.
Oh, man, that sounds stressful. One wrong move, and it's all over.
Pretty much. If you messed up the wording, used the wrong legal terms, your case could get thrown out no matter how strong your actual argument was.
Wow, there's no room for error there. It seems like that system was practically begging for miscarriages of justice.
You're not wrong. It definitely needed an update, and in the U.S. in the mid-1800s, there was an attempt to simplify things. It was called the Field Code. And the whole idea was to shift the focus away from those really rigid legal categories and really hone in on the actual facts of a case.
Okay, so focus on the evidence, what actually happened, not just the legal jargon. That sounds like a step in the right direction. Did it work? Did it actually change how things were done?
It was a good idea for sure, but old habits, they die hard, right? A lot of judges, they just clung to the old ways of doing things. They were used to that strict formal system, and they weren't eager to let it go.
So what was the turning point? What finally forced everyone to modernize the system?
The big one, the real game changer, was the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. They came around in 1938 and really shook things up.
1938, so pretty recent, all things considered. What did these new rules do? What was so revolutionary about them?
Well, for one thing, they merged the courts of law and equity, which before that were two separate systems. One was all about money damages, very cut and dry, and the other, equity, was more about fairness.
So two very different approaches to the law. Combining them, I can see how that would be a pretty big deal.
It was huge. But even more importantly, the federal rules shifted the entire mindset. It became about making sure everyone had their fair shot in court, substance over technicality.
Okay, I can get behind that. Substance over technicality. It sounds like that would make the legal system a lot fairer, less about who knows the most legal loopholes and more about actual justice.
That was the idea, at least. But of course, where there are rules, there are always those who try to bend them.
Oh, I have a feeling we're about to hear some stories about that. Lawyers being lawyers, right?
You bet. Even with the best of intentions, there's always, room for, shall we say, creative interpretation of the rules.
Oh, I'm sure there are some stories there. So how did the federal rules address that? How'd they try to keep things, from getting too out of hand?
They got a little something called Rule 11. You can think of it as like a code of conduct for lawyers, specifically when they're filing documents with the court.
Okay, so play nice, lawyers. Keep it above board.
Basically, it's all about making sure lawyers are backing up their arguments with, actual evidence.
No more just throwing accusations around and hoping something sticks.
That's the idea.
Right.
Rule 11, it says, look, if you're going to make a claim, you'd better have something solid to back it up.
Makes sense. But lawyers, being lawyers, I'm sure some still try to push the boundaries. So what happens if a lawyer tries to, let's say, bend Rule 11.
That's where the sanctions come in.
Sanctions, meaning
Consequences. It used to be, if a lawyer was found to have violated Rule 11, they'd automatically get hit with some kind of punishment. But over time, things have shifted a bit.
so it's not an automatic slap on the wrist anymore.
Not exactly. Now, judges have a bit more leeway. They get to decide whether sanctions are appropriate and how severe they should be. And the whole goal has shifted away from just punishing bad behavior after the fact and more towards deterring it in the first place.
Oh, so it's like, we're watching you. Don't even think about trying it.
Exactly. The threat of sanctions, it can be pretty powerful in keeping lawyers honest.
I bet. But we've been talking a lot about Rule 11, and it sounds like it plays a major role. But it's not the only tool in the toolbox when it comes to keeping litigation fair, right?
Yeah.
What about those inherent powers that courts have?
You've been doing your homework. You're right, Rule 11 isn't the be-all and end-all. Courts, they have this inherent authority to step in and ensure justice is served, even when there's not a specific rule that's been broken.
That's wild. So even if a lawyer technically stays within the lines of the rules, judges can still call them out if they're acting in bad faith.
Absolutely, and one of the most famous examples of that is the case of Chambers v. Nesco.
Ooh, case law. Always love a good legal thriller. Give us the rundown.
So in Chambers, you had this guy, right? He files this totally frivolous lawsuit, totally baseless, and his whole game plan, he was trying to gain leverage in a business deal.
So basically using the legal system as a bargaining chip.
Exactly. But the court, they saw right through him.
Busted. What happened?
They didn't let him get away with it, that's for sure. They hit him with some pretty hefty sanctions, including making him pay for all the other side's legal fees.
Oof. Talk about an expensive lesson.
Definitely sent a message to anyone else thinking about trying that tactic.
I bet. So we've talked about the historical context, the evolution of pleadings, the rules, Rule 11, courts' inherent powers. But what about the actual complaint itself? What does it actually look like, and what makes a good one?
Right, the million-dollar question. Well, for a long time, the thinking was, as long as you put the other side on notice about what you're claiming, that was pretty much good enough.
So like just the bare bones. Hey, you did me wrong. See you in court.
Pretty much. But as you can imagine, that system, well, it had some flaws.
I can see how that would be a recipe for, let's call them, creative interpretations of the truth.
Exactly. And that's where things start to get really interesting because a few landmark Supreme Court cases, they really changed the game. And it all started with Bell Atlantic v. Twombly in 2007.
Twombly. I came across that one in my research. It has something to do with this idea of plausibility, right?
You got it. Twombly, it introduced this whole new standard for complaints, and it really raised the bar for what's considered acceptable.
So no more vague accusations. No more, they did something wrong, I just know it.
Nope, you got to come with the goods. The court, they basically said, look, we're not asking you to lay out your entire legal strategy in the complaint, but you do need to give us something concrete to work with.
So what does that look like in practice? What's the difference between a plausible claim and one that just doesn't cut it?
Think of it this way. It's not enough to just allege that something could be true. You need to provide enough factual detail to show that your claim is actually believable, that it's plausible.
Okay, so it's not just, hey, this might be a thing. It's, hey, here's why I reasonably believe this is a thing.
Exactly. And this idea, it completely changed the game, shifting the burden more towards the plaintiff to show right out of the gate that they've got a strong case.
Makes sense. You don't want to clog up the courts with cases that are, well, let's face it, probably going nowhere.
That's a big part of it. The courts, they want to make sure they're using their resources wisely, focusing on cases that actually have merit. And Twombly, it gave them a tool to do just that.
But Twombly wasn't the end of the story, right? Didn't you mention another case, Iqbal, that built on these ideas?
Right. Ashcroft v. Iqbal, it came along a couple years later in 2009. And it took this whole plausibility standard and it said, you know what? This isn't just an antitrust thing. This applies to all civil cases.
Wow. So Twombly, it wasn't just a one-off ruling. It set a precedent that really echoed throughout the legal system.
It did. It really underscored the importance of having a strong factual basis for any lawsuit, regardless of what type of case it is.
So what was happening in Iqbal? What were the facts of that case?
So you've got this man, Javed Iqbal. He's a man who was detained after the September 11th attacks. And he alleged he was, subjected to really harsh treatment while he was in custody.
That's a really serious allegation. What did he claim happened?
He claimed he was targeted and mistreated based on his religion and his national origin. And to top it off, he sued some pretty high-level officials, including John Ashcroft, the former Attorney General, and Robert Mueller, who was the FBI director at the time.
Wow, he's not messing around. So what did he allege that these officials had done?
Iqbal claimed that they knew about and even endorsed these discriminatory policies that he said were being used against him and other detainees.
Okay, so we're talking about some really big accusations here, going straight to the top.
Absolutely. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the big question before the court, it wasn't whether these things actually happened, not at that stage. It was whether Iqbal's complaint, the way he presented his allegations, whether it met that plausibility standard set by Twombly.
So did it? Did the Supreme Court think his case was plausible?
The court, they sided with Ashcroft and Mueller.
Really? So even with such serious allegations, the court still said not plausible.
Well, it all boiled down to the specifics. See, the court said just because someone holds a high-ranking position, it doesn't automatically mean that they're personally responsible for everything that happens within their organization. And it doesn't automatically mean they endorse those actions.
So you can't just assume that because someone's in charge, they must have been in on it.
Exactly. You need more than just a hunch. You need some concrete evidence, or at least a really good explanation of why you think that evidence exists. And the court found that Iqbal's complaint, it just didn't have that level of specificity.
So even in a case with such serious potential implications, the plausibility standard, it still applied.
It did. And it really highlights how this concept of plausibility, it's not about making it harder to sue people or about protecting powerful people. It's about making sure that the legal system is functioning fairly efficiently, that it's not bogged down with lawsuits that, well, let's just say don't have a lot of merit to them.
It's about separating those cases that are, fishing expeditions from those that have genuine legal grounding.
Precisely. And it ensures that everyone who steps into a courtroom, they have a fair chance to present their case, but only if they can back it up with something substantial.
Now, that makes sense to me, but I have to ask, how do you actually apply this plausibility standard? Could you give us some concrete examples? Like, what makes a complaint plausible versus not so plausible?
Of course. Let's say you're suing someone for breach of contract. A plausible complaint, it wouldn't just say, hey, we had a contract, they broke it, pay us money.
Right, that's a little vague.
Exactly. A plausible complaint, it would lay out the specifics. What were the terms of the contract? How did the other party breach those terms? And importantly, what damages did you suffer as a result?
So it's about painting a clear picture for the court, showing them exactly what went wrong and why it matters.
Exactly. The more specific you can be, the more plausible your claim will be. And a good rule of thumb, think about it like you're telling a story. You need a beginning, a middle, and an end.
I like that analogy. It makes it much easier to understand. So it's not just about stating the legal conclusion. It's about providing the evidence, the context that supports that conclusion.
You got it.
So I'm starting to get a feel for this plausibility thing. It's about being specific, providing context, and showing the court why your claim is believable.
Exactly. And it's not about making it harder to file a lawsuit. It's about making sure that the cases that do move forward, they have merit.
It's about finding that balance, right, between ensuring access to justice for those who've been wronged, but also protecting everyone from frivolous and unfounded claims.
Absolutely. And ultimately, it's about maintaining the integrity of our legal system.
I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive into the world of legal pleadings.
I agree. It's been a pleasure exploring this fascinating and often overlooked aspect of the law.
It's been an eye-opening journey, that's for sure. And for our listeners, I think the biggest takeaway here is that the law, it's more than just what you see on TV. There's a whole lot of strategy, a whole lot of procedure that goes on behind the scenes. And those rules, those procedures, they really do matter. They shape how justice is served, and they ensure that everyone gets a fair shake in our legal system.
Well said. And hopefully next time you hear the term legal pleadings, it won't sound quite so dry and technical.
We'll consider that mission accomplished. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Until next time.
It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? We often focus on the big legal arguments, the courtroom showdowns, but it's these foundational elements, these pleadings, that really set the stage for everything that follows.
Absolutely. And the beauty of it is, well, maybe beauty isn't quite the right word, but the point is, these rules, these procedures, they're designed to ensure a level playing field, regardless of whether you're a powerful corporation or an individual.
It's about making sure everyone plays by the same rules, that the little guy has just as much of a shot at justice as anyone else.
Exactly. And that's something worth thinking about, especially today when we see so much talk about fairness and equity in all aspects of our society.
It's a good reminder that these principles, they're not just abstract ideas, they're embedded in the very fabric of our legal system.
Well said. And for our listener who, by now, probably have a newfound appreciation for the finer points of legal strategy, I have a final thought to leave you with. Next time you read about a big court case, don't just focus on the juicy details, the drama of it all. Think about all the behind-the-scenes legal maneuvering that had to happen just to get that case into court in the first place. Think about the complaints, the responses, the
The
motion.
strategy, the precision.
Exactly. It's a whole world unto itself, and it's fascinating.
It is, and it reminds us that the law, at its heart, it's about using these rules, these procedures, to achieve a just outcome, however complex that might be.
Beautifully put. That's a wrap on our deep dive into the world of legal pleadings. Until next time.